Okay, so tell me now what you see on the screen, Jewel. Do you see the slide that says constitutional basis for presidential power?
Yes, I do.
Okay, good. Barely hear you, but I think I heard enough to know that you said you can see it. Okay? All right, so let's move on with the ones that we haven't talked about. And I think we can dispense with those pretty quickly. I don't remember us talking about this one last time, right? But it's pretty straightforward, right? Congress does have the power under the Constitution to override a president's veto, although it's difficult, right? It's difficult because it requires an extraordinary majority, both in the House of Representatives and the Senate. It's a 2/3 majority required, and that's the biggest, explanation for why so few presidential vetoes are overridden. Okay. Although I think I told you in the last class meeting that war powers resolution that we were talking about was passed by Congress, and President Nixon vetoed it, and then Congress overrode President Nixon's veto, which, I think is a pretty good indication that Congress was determined to rein in the president in that area of war making. Okay. All right. I'm pretty deliberate about my use of the term nominate here, because a lot of sources will say, textbooks and popular media sources and so on will say, the Constitution gives the president the power to appoint federal judges and ambassadors and so on. But I really like to emphasize the point that appointment power is a shared power. It's not a unilateral power of the president. The president has the power under the Constitution to nominate those officers, but they are subject to Senate confirmation. It's clear that the framers of the Constitution wanted this to be a power that was shared by the president and the Senate specifically. Okay? And I think it is contrary to the Constitution when people out there in the political arena suggest that the Senate ought to just give the president whoever he wants. As if somehow the Senate ought to just rubber stamp the president's nominees. I think that's not consistent with the intent of the framers at all. It says, it contemplates not only a confirmation role for the Senate, but presumably an advisory role for the Senate as well. All right, so that's a shared power under the Constitution. And then similarly, I've indicated here the power to negotiate treaties. Because even though the Constitution says in Article 2 that he shall have the power to make treaties, I left out a little clause there. It says he shall have the power by and with the advice and consent of the Senate to make treaties. So the president can negotiate treaties, but they are subject to the ratification of the United States Senate. And there have been historically some very noteworthy treaties that the United States Senate has not ratified. For example, some of you are probably going to remember this from your American history course, the treaty that established the League of Nations after World War I. You remember learning about the League of Nations? Okay. Who would we look to be sort of the creator of, or like the idea of the League of Nations? It was Woodrow Wilson, right? The American president. Yet the United States Senate refused to ratify that treaty, and so the United States never became a member of the League of Nations, which probably is a big part of the explanation for why the League of Nations failed. The United Nations, of course, after World War II was a different story. But there have been many other, notable treaties that the United States Senate has chosen, or there hasn't been the votes to ratify. Okay? All right, so each of these, it's a short list, and one is moot, and the other is a unilateral power of the president, but there are political limitations on it. The remaining ones that are checked here, there is some counterbalancing power vested in the United States Congress. Okay? So when I started by saying that the framers of the Constitution envisioned a weak chief executive, that's what I mean, right? Like, they could have never imagined the presidency that we think of today, and which is why, going back to this point here, all of these powers, these duties and roles and responsibilities that textbooks typically attribute to the presidency are at best assumed, right? We assume that these are the powers of the presidency. They are certainly not constitutional in nature, rather they're political in nature. And that's really an important point. So on that point, I want to finish this up by sharing with you some thoughts that have been developed by scholars who study the American presidency. In the 1960s, a political scientist by the name of Richard Neustadt, who had been in the Kennedy administration, had been an advisor to President John F. Kennedy after his time in the Kennedy administration. After Kennedy was assassinated, he returned to academic life. I think he went to Harvard, and he wrote a book called The Power To Persuade. This has been a significant thesis ever since. People who study the American presidency still refer to Neustadt's thesis that the real power that we imagine that the president possesses is political in nature. That is to say, it really amounts to little more than the president's ability to persuade other actors in our system of government to follow his lead. Neustadt's thesis is that the president's power, the positive power of the president, the ability of the president to carry out any of these roles or duties or responsibilities that we associate with the presidency, the modern presidency, amount to little more than the president's ability to persuade others to follow his lead. The president, we don't have a system where the president can command others to do his bidding. It's not that kind of system. So if you think about, I'm not going to go back to the slide, but if you think about all those roles and duties, powers, responsibilities that are associated by textbook authors of textbooks with the modern presidency, chief policymaker, chief legislator, all of, even the constitutional roles, the ability of a president to perform that role, all of those roles simultaneously, certainly, is to imagine a kind of political power that doesn't exist in our political system. The ability of the president to be chief legislator and chief diplomat and crisis manager and manager of the economy and all those other roles and duties that were on that list is on a sustained basis, simultaneously. To do all this is to imagine that the president can muster up a kind of political power that just doesn't exist in our system. In fact, I would suggest to you that the ability of a president to perform even one of those roles, including the constitutional roles, say the constitutional role of commander-in-chief, on a sustained basis, is going to be very, very difficult. I think I shared the story with you, if it wasn't in the last class meeting, maybe the class meeting before, about the experience of President Clinton shortly after he came to office, and he announced that he was going to rescind the ban on service by gays and lesbians in the U.S. military. And you got this huge backlash. Where did I tell you that this backlash came from? I mean, it came from a number of quarters, but what did I focus on? Yeah, remember, it was to a large extent, it was the top brass in the military, right? In particular, I shared this with you, right? This guy who went around giving these speeches referring to the president, the commander-in-chief. Think about this for a second. Of all of the institutions in our society that you would expect to be organized on a hierarchical basis with a clear chain of command, and subordinates carrying out the orders of their superiors, saluting and saying, yes, sir, without question, right? You would think the one institution that would come closest to that would be the military. And the president is, by the Constitution, under the Constitution, the commander-in-chief. So for top leadership in the United States military officers like this guy to go around criticizing the president, their commander-in-chief, that tells you a lot. Why aren't they just saluting and saying, yes, sir, and carrying out the president's commands if he's commander-in-chief, if that's the way that it works? See what I mean? Even the constitutional role of commander-in-chief, or certainly chief executive. Chief executive, somehow we imagine that the president sits at the top of this massive bureaucracy and can command not only political appointees, but career civil servants to carry out his orders without question or without balking. It just doesn't happen that way in our system. That's what I mean when I say it's imagining a kind of political power that simply doesn't exist in our system. The president has to be able to persuade, according to Neustadt, has to be able to persuade others to follow his lead. Okay? So here, I'm going to finish on this point so we can turn to our topic on the bureaucracies. That leaves us with there's a lot of different theories out there of presidential power, but two I want to share with you. Okay? One, we're going to call literalist theory. Okay? Literalist theory of presidential power says that the president literally only has those powers that are delegated to the presidency by the Constitution. One can be a literalist of congressional power as well. And there are those who are literalists of congressional power. There are those who argue that Congress only has the powers that are expressly delegated by the Constitution. In other words, to go back to an example that we gave several weeks ago when we were talking a little bit about the nature of, the theory of our Constitution, the nature of the national government's power, I think I remember asking you to consider the question of, can Congress pass a law that requires individuals to have health care insurance, which is really the biggest part of so-called Obamacare back in 2010 when Congress passed that legislation. Well, the opponents argued, this is essentially what the argument was, the constitutional argument was against Obamacare. It doesn't say in the Constitution that Congress can do that. You see, they were taking a very literal interpretation of Congress's power under the Constitution. So just like you can have people out there who will argue a literalist theory of congressional power, you also have people out there that can argue a literalist theory of presidential power, that the president only has those powers that are delegated by the Constitution. And again, that would return us to this short list. But there is another theory out there, much certainly in the early 21st century, in fact, for much of the last 100 years, a much more widely ascribed to theory, okay, which says that the president is not limited literally to only those powers that are expressly delegated in the Constitution. There are certain powers that are inherent in the office of the presidency because as the executive, historically certain powers have attached to the executive. So that doesn't all have to be specifically in the Constitution, they argue. The president is the steward of the nation. It's a metaphorical, I don't know if you know what a ship's steward is, right? But as the steward of the ship of state, so to speak in sort of lofty poetic terms, the president has certain powers, these inherent powers that really have their origins in the powers that were exercised by the kings of Europe. It's not an argument that the president is a king or he should have, absolute powers like a king. It is an argument that says that, well, executive power, the kind of power that, originates in European monarchies has, manifests in certain ways in the American presidency as well. So it doesn't all have to be in the Constitution. The president, in his role as the steward of the nation, can undertake power as long as there's some reasonable basis in the Constitution. It doesn't have to be specifically there. Okay? So which of these two theories do you think, based on your observations, or maybe, other information that you've encountered either in courses that you've taken or things that you've read or seen or whatever, would you say that presidents themselves ascribe to? Certainly, let's say in the modern period, right? Let's say over the last 100 years. Sure, yeah. I mean, whether it's not a Democratic position or a Republican position, we've seen both Democratic and Republican presidents operate in a manner that would suggest that they are much more operating in a fashion that's much more consistent with the assumptions of stewardship theory. We'd have to go back a pretty long way, I think, to find a president, to name a president who's, operated in a manner that would suggest, a literalist interpretation of constitutional power. I'm not a presidential scholar, so I'm going to have to defer to others, but I think we'd have to go back certainly to before FDR, absolutely, but maybe even back to the 19th century. I don't know, maybe somebody like Calvin Coolidge or somebody like that, or Herbert Hoover or somebody like that. I just don't really know, to be honest with you, enough about their presidencies to comment in any authoritative way. But certainly since the presidency of Roosevelt, no president has operated according to the literalist model. Okay? Questions, comments? So one of the things I think that we can say, and to wrap this up, is that Franklin Roosevelt seemed to understand this point very well that we're trying to make here. Franklin Roosevelt once commented that the presidency will be as big as the person who occupies it, and that it is ultimately a place of political leadership. It's an office of political leadership. He seemed to understand the political nature of presidential power. But what that means is, when we say that it's personal, okay, it means that the powers that we attribute to the institution, we shouldn't attribute to the institution. It depends on the person who occupies the office. And that means that some presidents are going to be able to do it better than others. Some presidents are going to be able to do it better at some times than at others. It's episodic in nature. Okay? In fact, those two adjectives right there, let me just end on that point so we can move to the bureaucracies. Okay? I think maybe the two adjectives that best describe the reality of presidential power, all of this, in other words, we can say is largely myth. Okay, this is the myth. The myth is that somehow these powers are vested in the institution of the presidency. The reality is that, number one, it's personal. Okay? That is to say, the powers, the extent to which the president can undertake or perform these roles successfully depends on the person, the political leadership skills of the person, and it also means that it's going to occur in episodes. It's episodic. It's not going to be able to, even the strongest political leaders who have been in the office of the presidency are going to be successful sometimes and not so successful other times. Okay. Let's shift gears a little bit. I debated a lot because I knew that we were going to have to take a little bit of time to finish up the topic on the presidency in today's class meeting. I debated a lot about how to handle the topic on the bureaucracies. If I launch into a lecture, we're not going to be able to cover everything that we need to cover. So here's what I'm going to do, okay? I'm going to share with you some video files. This is very unusual. Never done this before. We'll see how it works. I'm going to share with you I have a number of video files here. Oh, let me do this because I took this off. Okay, Jewel, tell me what you see on the screen. Do you see a page that says 2305 week 12 classroom lectures?
Yes.
Okay, so I have 16 files here. Most of them run, 3 minutes or less. Okay, and we're just going to get through as many of these as we can. Okay, I can't enforce the discipline on myself if I'm lecturing live. Okay, so I'm going to use these video files to enforce the discipline. And we'll watch as many of these as we can, and then I'll link the rest of them up for you on the course website. Okay, so having said that, let's just get through a few of these. These are files that I've used in
early in 1977.
These are files that I've used previously in Government 2305 classes. So, and they're kind of old, okay? I think I've made these probably about 15 years ago or something like that, but they're pretty general in nature. So I think it all still applies pretty well, okay?
Early in 1977, shortly after being inaugurated as the 39th President of the United States, Jimmy Carter was conferring in a White House office with an aide when two mice scampered across the carpet. The General Services Administration, which cares for federal buildings, was summoned to the White House, and the President resumed his grapplings with the affairs of state. But the mouse problem persisted. Days before Latin American heads of state arrived for the signing of the Panama Canal treaties, one small gray creature crawled inside a White House wall and died. The Oval Office became scented with the odor of the deceased. The General Services Administration was again summoned. The agency declared in its report to the President that it had killed all the mice inside the White House, and that therefore the expired mouse must have come from outside of the edifice. An outside mouse, GSA explained, was the responsibility of the Interior Department, which cares for the White House grounds. The Interior Department respectfully but firmly demurred. Obviously, the mouse was now inside, since it was embedded within a White House wall. "I can't even get a damn mouse out of my office," the President complained. So he summoned an official from each agency to sit before his desk to witness the odor. Soon the bureaucratic deadlock was broken and the Oval Office's normal atmosphere was restored. But the episode troubled an aide who had overseen its resolution and whose own grand notions of presidential power included the expectation that a presidential command, once given, was promptly and automatically obeyed. Ruefully, he observed, "It took an interagency task force to get that mouse out of the White House."
Okay. A nice transition, I guess, from the previous topic that we were having on presidential power.
The story of Jimmy Carter and the White House mouse reinforces a popularly held view of government bureaucracies in the United States. Bureaucracy has become a negative term, equated with red tape, paper shuffling, duplication of effort, waste and inefficiency, impersonality, senseless regulations, and unresponsiveness to the needs of real people. But bureaucracy is really a form of social organization found not only in governments, but also in corporations, schools, armies, and many other social institutions. The model for administrative management of American government is lodged in the United States Constitution. Because citizens and public servants sometimes lose sight of this fact, public administration of the people's government is often misunderstood. Pursuant to Article 1 of the Constitution, the legislative powers of the central government are, quote, vested in a Congress of the United States, unquote. Legislative governance is described in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution and includes the power to tax, borrow money, regulate commerce among the states, establish uniform rules of naturalization and bankruptcies, coin money, make laws to punish counterfeiters, establish post offices and post roads, promote the progress of science and useful arts, create courts inferior to the Supreme Court, define and punish piracies, declare war, raise and support armies and navies, create a seat for the national government, and make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the powers that are vested in Congress and the other branches of government. The growth of government parallels the needs of the people and the intent of Congress, which creates laws to carry out the constitutional powers vested in it in Article 1. The central government today, however large or complex, exists to fulfill the objectives expressed in Article 1. Administration of these objectives cannot be individually performed by either a single representative or senator or by the legislature as a body. Therefore, through the legislative process, Congress transfers its authority, but not its powers, to the president and other public administrators to carry out the law. Today, there are nearly 100 federal agencies created by Congress to govern the republic. Collectively, these agencies constitute the bureaucracies that collects taxes, regulates public health and safety, protects the environment, establishes standards for working conditions, controls aviation, assures that public welfare is properly administered, issues licenses to broadcasters and cable television companies, protects the public against monopolistic and unfair trade practices, enforces civil rights and anti-discrimination statutes, manages export and import laws, enforces immigration laws, provides for internal and international security for the nation, and otherwise responds to public demands for government service.
If you have questions, please don't hesitate to ask as we move from one to the next. Anything?
The system of government, which was fashioned by the delegates to the Constitutional Convention in the summer of 1787, was a practical application of ideals which James Madison established mainly in theory and law. Madison, like most of the framers of the American Constitution, was preoccupied with the ideal of limited government. Their experiences with the British Crown had taught them that the best way to limit the power of government was to structure it in such a way as to prevent the accumulation of too much political power in the hands of one individual or one group of individuals. Separation of powers was one of the structural mechanisms incorporated into the Constitution that serves to decentralize political power. For Madison, limited prudent government basically meant that institutional arrangements should be based on the principle of countervailing and balanced powers. Specifically, the principle involves the assumption that there are three intrinsically distinct types of political power: the legislative power, or the power to make laws, the executive power, or the power to execute or enforce the laws, and the judicial power, or the power to adjudicate or decide cases based on the law. Madison argued that there should be three distinct branches of government to exercise each type of political power. The Founding Fathers found it desirable to separate political powers into three separate branches of government for two reasons. One, to keep to a minimum the powers lodged in any single organ of government, and two, to be able to oppose each organ of government against the others. This latter principle is often referred to as checks and balances. Checks and balances means that each branch of government possesses some kind of veto power over the others. At a minimum, each branch must be able to protect its own independence arising from its unique constitutional powers. The chief purpose of checks and balances, according to Madison, is the protection of minority and individual rights. True to their classical liberal preferences and values, the American Founding Fathers inherently distrusted any government of concentrated powers. Such governments were the very definition of tyranny. For the early Americans, tyranny meant the loss of individual rights and freedoms. Thus, the Madisonian model aims at preventing popular majorities from getting control of government and turning it towards their own ends. In this vein, Madison warns of the tyranny of the majority, the momentary passions of the people, and mob rule. So various barricades were erected against majority rule, including the indirect election of the president and senators and the appointment of judges. Therefore, the requirements of bicameralism, the presidential veto, and the power of judicial review were all mechanisms designed to thwart popular majorities and preserve individual and minority rights. The concept of separation of powers held by Madison and the other founders then can be summed up in the following propositions. 1, there are 3 intrinsically distinct types of political power: legislative, executive, and judicial. 2, these 3 types of political power ought to be exercised by 3 separate branches of government, which should be constitutionally independent from and equal to the others. And 3, there should be an overlapping of functions to ensure that each branch will check and balance the others. The framers understood the consequences of their framework. They preferred protracted action, even stalemate, to efficiency in government. They did not want a government which could act quickly. A government with the ability to act quickly or efficiently, even when circumstances might seem to make those values appropriate, was also a government that could act quickly and efficiently to take away individual and minority rights. They did not propose indefinite deadlock, but they did prefer government wait until such a popular consensus was built up in favor of some action that all of the separated institutions would have been brought into agreement.
Much of what you've seen to this point is concepts, topics that we've previously covered. More specifically with respect to bureaucracy.
The debate over the proper role and powers of bureaucracies in the American system of government is a testament to the holding power of Madisonian ideals. Essentially, the critics of the bureaucracies argue that their policymaking activities violate the principle of separation of powers. Every first-year American government student knows, or should know, that the legislature makes the law, the executive enforces the law, and the courts adjudicate the law. Bureaucracies then, in their capacities as executive agencies, should merely administer the laws consistent with the intent expressed when the Congress passed them and the President signed them. Yet rarely does Congress prescribe in minutia in a piece of legislation the details of how an agency should go about administering the legislature's intent. The reasons for this seem obvious. Legislators cannot foresee all of the possible scenarios that might develop, nor are they experts in the particular areas which most programs deal. Therefore, typically, agencies are given some latitude, called administrative discretion, concerning how to best implement their missions. The discretion that the legislature gives to an agency is usually exercised through rulemaking or adjudication. These administrative procedures may result in the issuing of regulations. Since they are authorized by congressional statutes, regulations have the force of law. Likewise, most agencies have an administrative law court which adjudicates individual conflicts which arise with respect to the regulations issued by the respective agency. Many critics complain that rulemaking and adjudication violate separation of powers because all 3 functions of government, legislating, enforcing, and judging, are being carried out by a single agency. The federal executive branch is composed of 3 types of bureaucratic organizations: cabinet departments, independent establishments, and government corporations. Each of these are large, complex organizations characterized by a number of things. The German sociologist Max Weber described bureaucracy as a rational way for society to organize itself that is characterized by chain of command, the hierarchical structure of authority in which command flows downward, a division of labor among many specialized workers in the organization, which is intended to promote task specialization and designed to improve the productivity of the organization. Specification of authority means that there are clear lines of responsibility with positions and units reporting to superiors. Goal orientation means that the organizational goals determine the structure, authority, and rules of procedure of the bureaucracy. And finally, impersonality means the treatment of all persons within a bureaucracy on the basis of merit, and all of the clients served by the bureaucracy equal according to the rules of procedure.
Any questions about those ideas associated with the classical model or the Weberian model? Max Weber. Have any of you heard of Max Weber before? Who's taken a sociology course? Yeah? They teach you about Max Weber and okay, yeah. Still do. Good, that's good. Okay. Weber's model, the classical model as we sometimes call it, has these very clearly defined qualities, okay? Chain of command, as you heard, I'm not going to go back through all that again, but any questions about any of those? Impersonality, how about impersonality? What does that suggest? So is Weber saying that bureaucracies ought to treat people impersonally? Isn't that kind of what people rail against, or they bristle against? That people don't like being treated impersonally, do they? Why? So the argument of the classical model is saying that bureaucracies operate according to rules of procedure that I guess many people see as being rigid, but they treat one of those is that they treat people impersonally. Okay, why? I tell you what. Let me give you a scenario. Let's say that you, when you decided to go to school, you realized you were going to need some financial aid help, right? So you go down to the financial aid office, sit down across, this is in pre-COVID days, right? Sit across from the financial aid officer, kind of looks you up and down and says, I don't like those, piercings that you have. Get out of my office. You're not getting any financial aid. What would your reaction to that be? How many of you think that's the way a financial aid officer ought to treat people? The next person comes in, oh yeah, you look like a nice conservatively dressed, you get financial aid. I'm obviously a ridiculous example, but I'm trying to make a point here. Maybe you get it, but you got to let me know that you get it, right? No, not just by nodding, by 11. What are we trying to suggest here about treating people impersonally?
It's treating people so you can then treat people equally without prejudice.
That's right. It's about fairness. Right? People, I oftentimes wonder about students who say they just want to be treated fairly. Do they really want to be treated fairly? Because sometimes when you treat students according to established rules of procedure and so on, the first thing that they say a lot of times is, you're not being fair. People don't want to be, oftentimes, not just students, but in general, people don't want to be treated impersonally in that way. They want you to believe that their circumstances are so exceptional that the rules shouldn't be applied. That they should be given additional time, or they should, have, special circumstances applied to them. All the classical model is saying is that that's a bad way to treat people because it invites arbitrariness. Okay.
The general fragmentation of power, which increasingly characterized the American political system in the latter part of the 20th century, has led to the phenomenon of what many scholars of American politics have called policymaking by subgovernment, or iron triangle. This concept suggests that most of the important federal policy decisions are not made according to the formal process prescribed in the Constitution and described in many civics textbooks. More correctly, decision-making is better depicted as an informal process where policies in particular substantive areas are developed in a cozy, three-sided arrangement among the appropriate bureaucratic agency or agencies, the relevant committees or subcommittees of Congress, and affected interest, usually industry groups. The traditional ideal of Congress as a committee of the whole making law is simply inoperative. The congressional norms of specialization and deference to committees has meant that most decisions are rarely challenged on the floor by the membership. Recently, the concept of policymaking by subgovernments has been challenged by scholars who prefer the term issue networks. The basic difference between the two concepts is that the latter allows for participation in the decision-making process by advocacy groups other than industry interests. The idea that bureaucracies and substantive congressional committees usually make policy decisions, however, remains unchallenged. The participation of advocacy groups in the decision-making process is essential to bureaucracies. Advocacy groups typically are the beneficiaries of the programs or services that a bureaucracy is responsible for implementing, and include both the target groups of the programs, clientele groups, and frequently professional groups who may indirectly be involved in the implementation of the programs. For example, the elderly are undoubtedly the primary beneficiaries of the Medicare program, while physicians and hospitals reap spillover benefits. Thus, elderly Americans and their national association, the American Association of Retired Persons, constitute an important clientele group of the Social Security Administration. The American Medical Association would be an important professional association involved in this issue network. Because the clientele groups and professional associations have a vested interest in the services and programs that bureaucracies implement, they have become an important source of political power for federal agencies. When the president or Congress threatens to reorganize, abolish programs, cut services, or pare budgets, affected clientele and professional groups bring pressure to bear on elected officials to help defend bureaucratic turf.
Okay, questions about that? Two concepts that were introduced right there. The concept of I use the term subgovernment, but a lot of textbooks use the term policy triangles or iron triangles. I think maybe the authors of your textbook use that term. That's the first concept. That's the concept that goes way back, probably 100 years or more in the literature, in an attempt to describe how decisions are made. Do you remember when we were talking about Congress, one of the points that we emphasized was that we ought not think about Congress as a unified decision-making body, that power is spread out all over the place in Congress. It's a fragmented institution, and that decisions, the important decisions, are certainly routinely made at the committee or subcommittee level. In fact, we emphasize the point that less than 10% of legislative proposals are ever reported out to the floor for a vote. So the decision-making really occurs at that committee or subcommittee level. Well, what we didn't say at the time, because we weren't there yet, but now we are, is that it's not just the committees and the subcommittees of Congress, of the House of Representatives and the Senate, but they're sort of made in this notion of a subgovernment that includes the appropriate bureaucratic agency. Okay? If we're talking, for example, about a farm bill, which is, I think, the example that we kept using in the previous class meeting when we were talking about Congress, you're talking about the relevant committees of the House and Senate, both the full standing committees and the subcommittees that are an important part of that decision-making on this bill. But you're also talking about, at a minimum, the Department of Agriculture. That's part of this. There's two of the pieces of the iron triangle right there. Well, what is the other piece of that iron triangle? If we're going to apply this model of the policy triangle, or what I call a subgovernment, well, you've got the affected interests, in this case, farmers, right? That's where the decisions are made, in that sort of relationship. And they're sort of mutually reinforcing. Congress provides to the agency the budgetary resources and so on that it needs. The agency provides to the clientele group, in this case the farmers, the program benefits that they want, and then the clientele group, in this case the farmers, provides the political support to Congress or to the committee members and subcommittee members of the House Agriculture Committee and the Senate Committee, right? So that's that mutually reinforcing policy triangle that scholars have been talking about for a century, okay? But over the last half century, let's say, maybe a little less, they've modified that concept somewhat to suggest it's a little bit more complicated than this just sort of cozy three-sided relationship. That's where this concept of an issue network comes in. So that you have other relevant actors who are part of the decision-making process as well. Go out when you have a spare minute and you're on the internet doing something else. Maybe you can divert your attention away from whatever you're doing. Just like Google issue networks, right? And maybe just like Google images. Don't even look for like descriptions. Just like Google images. They can get pretty complicated, right? You'll be surprised. Google issue networks and see some of the pictures. If you were to Google iron triangle, you're just going to get the same thing. It might look a little bit different. They may use different colors or whatever, but you're going to get a three-sided relationship, right? But if you Google issue networks, they get pretty complicated, right? All right. Let's see, it was this one, wasn't it? Let's do this one.
The size of the federal executive branch establishment is quite large today, certainly when compared to the size of the federal executive branch at the founding of the Republic. Major periods of growth in the federal executive branch include the late 1800s, the 1930s, and the 1960s. Bureaucratic growth can be measured in terms of the total number of executive branch agencies, the total number of executive branch employees, the budgets of executive agencies in constant dollars, or the jurisdiction of executive agencies, that is their span of control or the number of programs they administer. Several reasons have been offered to explain this growth in federal bureaucracy. As the national government has responded to public demands to regulate business practices, new agencies have been created to prevent the formation of trusts, to ensure the safety of foods and pharmaceuticals and consumer products, to protect air and water quality, and to regulate trading practices in securities markets, to name just a few. Second, as the national government has responded to public demands to guarantee income security, new agencies have been created to determine eligibility and to distribute welfare benefits. Third, as the national government has responded to public demands to take a leadership role in promoting scientific discovery and the development of new technologies, new agencies have been established to explore space, to fight disease and encourage medical research, and to develop nuclear energy, among others. The point should be clear. New government bureaucracies do not simply emerge for no reason. Existing agencies do not grow or expand as a result of some uncontrollable mystical force. New agencies are created and the span of control of existing agencies is increased in response to public demands for an increased role for government in regulating business enterprises, providing income security, and encouraging scientific and technological progress. Some commentators have attributed the growth of federal bureaucracies to the American cultural belief in progress, or the technology fix, as some term it. They observe that Americans generally believe that most problems can be solved if the appropriate hard or soft technologies can be developed. This implies an important role for expertise and experts, many of whom are located in government bureaucracies. This mentality, they say, enhances the general stature and span of authority of bureaucratic agency. Finally, other analysts have attributed the growth of federal bureaucracies to bureaucratic imperialism. This is the idea that agency administrators seek more staff, bigger budgets, more programs to administer, and more clients to serve as a means of political survival.
Yeah, I think I told you before I hit play on the first one that I produced these videos when I first started teaching online classes about 15 years ago. If I was redoing them today, I might want to say some of those things a little bit differently. For example, on the point there about the technology fix, and particularly the tendency of Americans to revere expertise. I guess some commentators today might question that. Recent episodes might indicate that there's at least a portion of the American public that seems to reject the notion of expertise. Maybe the coronavirus epidemic would be an illustration of that there's a significant portion of the population that just doesn't trust the expertise of the CDC. Right? Maybe that's a new development, or maybe it's been there all along, but it certainly seems to be something that there's at least some aspect of the population or some portion of the population that's becoming more vocal in its rejection of expertise generally, but particularly government bureaucracy expertise. Okay. More generally, I think the point of that segment was that people like to talk about the growth of bureaucracies. This is certainly nothing new. For a long, long time in this country, critics have argued that bureaucracies grow, but when they talk about it, they seem to suggest that it just happens like out of a vacuum. Now, of course, bureaucracies are just going to grow. That's the nature of bureaucracies. But I think the evidence suggests otherwise, that bureaucracies grow in fits and starts. Okay, we've had several major periods in our history, the latter part of the 19th century, particularly like around the 1880s. As I said, the 1930s was another period, and the 1960s was another period where we've had significant growth of bureaucracy, right? But in each instance, it was in response to some demands that had emerged in public expectations about government response. In the 1930s, for example, during the Great Depression, there was a demand that built up that the government needs to do something. The government needs to respond to this economic emergency, protracted economic emergency that we have, right? In the 1960s, it was with the environmental agenda, for example, and the new regulators in the area of consumer product safety and the safety of automobiles, for example, or the safety of pharmaceutical products and so on. We haven't always had agencies out there that regulate to ensure that the pharmaceutical products that you buy, whether they're prescriptions or over-the-counter products, are safe to use. Here in our history where, somebody might have sold snake oil, right, as a cure for this or that, and there would have been no government agency out there to prevent that, right? Well, over time, the demand builds up that we, as a society, we want safer pharmaceutical products. Right? We want safer consumer products. We don't want to open a box and have something explode out of the box and gouge our eyes out, right? Like, you buy a child a toy for Christmas and they open it and now they're no longer have their left eye. We want an agency of the government to regulate and ensure, regulate from the French to mean, from the French word regular to make regular, okay? You got to get rid of that emotional baggage that a lot of people have, knee-jerk reactions sort of when they hear the word regulate. Like, oh, that in and of itself is undesirable. It just really means to make regular, to standardize, right? That's what, in general, the role of these regulatory agencies is, okay? All right, we don't have a whole lot of time left. Let's watch at least one last one. And somehow didn't get linked. Let's figure that out.
Grammarly does more than catch errors. With Grammarly, you can...
It is highly misleading, however, to suggest that because agencies exercise functions that are quasi-legislative, or sort of like legislating, and quasi-judicial, sort of like judging, that they are out of control, or that separation of powers is being disregarded. Legislatures do routinely delegate policymaking authority to bureaucracies. but it is important to remember that they can also rein in any agency that acts too arbitrarily. To be more precise, the legislature can revise legislation that affects the bureaucracy's activities. In other words, the Constitution provides the resolution to the problem of imperial bureaucracy. That is, Congress may transfer legislative powers to a bureaucracy, but it does not surrender its legislative power. If Congress can delegate the power, then it can also take it away. Additionally, there are numerous other mechanisms which the legislature may use to control a bureaucratic agency. It can reduce the agency's appropriations. It can abolish programs that an agency has responsibility for implementing. It can investigate a bureaucracy's activities and force administrators to testify about their activities before an oversight hearing. It can influence the appointment of agency heads or other top bureaucrats. And it can write legislation which forces a bureaucracy to answer for its performance. For example, sunset legislation. Calling the bureaucracy the fourth branch of government means that the view that the president, in his capacity as chief executive officer, is somehow in control of the bureaucracies is grossly inaccurate. However, that does not mean that the chief executive has no means to influence bureaucratic activities. The president can appoint and fire many agency heads and some other top bureaucrats, propose new policies or changes in existing ones which would, if enacted by Congress, affect the bureaucracy's activities, reorganize a bureaucracy, of course, subject to congressional approval, and adjust through rescissions and deferrals the annual budget of an agency. Additionally, the president can resist legislative initiatives originating with the bureaucracy and issue executive orders for the bureaucracies to follow. Finally, the courts play a role in holding the bureaucracies accountable as well. Minimally, the federal courts review the decisions of administrative law courts. Any individual who loses a case in an agency's administrative law court is legally entitled to an automatic appeal to the DC Court of Appeals. In this capacity, the courts can judge whether bureaucrats have acted within the law and force them to change their practices to be consistent with the law. And second, force a bureaucracy to respect individuals' rights in hearings or other proceedings. Considering the immense tools the constitutional branches of government have over bureaucracies, it is difficult to understand the criticisms of those who complain that the fourth branch of government has usurped the powers of the other three. It must be conceded, however, that bureaucracies have developed their own political power and have evolved means of protecting their turf. Although the founding fathers never could have envisioned it, bureaucracies have become another countervailing force in our system of separated powers.
Okay, we're just about out of time, so that's going to be the extent of the ones that we'll play here in class. But I am going to link these up for you. Look in the on the course website. Let me go to our course here real quick. Look in the navigation pane on the left-hand side of the screen. I will put down here somewhere bureaucracy videos or something like that. Okay, and that you can go out and watch the rest of these. All right, we'll see you on. We'll get back on track with our regular process on Tuesday, talking about the courts.